we'll do the live thing first. Like. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time watching, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always said, if you ever want to reach out to the podcast for whatever reason, hit us up. Let us know if you want to hear about an episode or come on and join us here on the podcast. We'd always love to have you. Actually, most guests that have been on here have got on that way, so I'd love to have more people on. Welcome to the studio while it lasts. Anyway, we're gonna be moving the studio soon. That's gonna be super fun. It's gonna be in, I'd say, a mildly temporary zone for a little bit, and then it's going to go into a whole new studio. I'll leave it at that. We'll keep some mystery to it, but again, come on in while supplies last, and we'll get you on here and get the word out. Again, the best way you could possibly help out and support the podcast is by being here and doing what you're doing right now, listening, watching. If you're on YouTube, if you're on Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you're listening or watching the podcast, welcome and thank you so much for being here. If you did want to ever go give it a little bit more support, make sure you like and subscribe and do all that fun stuff. That really helps push the podcast out there. And then we also have our patreon.com/bigmarkpod if you want to check that out. There's a couple different tiers there. So again, thank you all for being here. I'm excited about today's episode. As always, we're going to be talking about Big Fish, the novel Big Fish by Daniel Wallace. I have a copy here, which was gifted to me by my buddy Chris Bunting for my birthday. Thanks, Bunts. I just finished listening to it. Again, I just never find myself sitting down reading a book as much as I love the information and the stories and stuff and all that. My best way, and I've noticed since I'm on the road and moving around, the best time to listen to a book or to take in a book is through audiobooks, and the best time to listen to it is while you're driving. So I remember when I was delivering beer kegs, I probably listened to 50, 60 books over a course of about a year, maybe 2 years. I don't think I did it for more than a year and a half, but yeah, it was like again, I've just always enjoyed that. So when people give me books, sometimes I'll just look up the audiobook and then take it in that way. I mean, I'm still taking in the evidence, or still taking in the evidence. Oh my God. I'm still taking in the actual information, but I could still pull this out if I ever wanted to actually take it in. Cause I know I've done podcasts on the subject, but audiobooks are kind of interesting, right? They do convey the same information. Yes. But most of the time, at least when it comes to fiction, most authors write in the sense of they know that their reader is going to be reading a book, especially old school books like from the 50s, 60s, 70s, where there wasn't a lot of like audiobooks happening, especially for fiction. And it was like sometimes an author would structure their sentences different, and there's modern authors that do that as well now. I think even in Infinite Jest, there's like some different ways the sentences are structured, and then that like IQ 84 or whatever that one novel is, I think there's like different structures, which again, as a reader, you're taking in that information differently. And yes, using your visual cortex to start the processing is a little bit different than using your auditory cortex, all these different things, but it still all gets down to business. So anyway, let's get down to business. So we're talking about Big Fish, Daniel Wallace. Generally speaking, this is, if you've ever heard of Big Fish, you probably heard of it as the movie. Tim Burton actually adapted Big Fish to a movie, and it's actually one of the only movies I've seen my pops cry watching. And it is sad. I haven't actually watched it much recently, but it definitely has some tearjerker moments. And it's, of course, it's an excellent father-son story. I mean, unfortunately, it's about a father who's dying and a son kind of trying, searching for truth, because his father can only really speak in stories, and he's kind of always speaking in ways and telling about his life in a kind of grandiose, hyperbolic way. And it has come to his deathbed for his son to finally be like, Pops, like, you got to give me the answers straight. Like, you got to tell me what's going on. And throughout the novel, his dad really can't help but tell these stories. And again, you know, it's an interesting exploration in memory and identity, and of course storytelling. Daniel Wallace himself he's an American novelist. He's also an illustrator and professor. He's probably best known for his work authoring Big Fish, again, which inspired Tim Burton's 2003 film adaptation. And again, it's his blend of magical realism and Southern storytelling has really cemented his place in American fiction. He is from Birmingham, Alabama, born 1959, and he's actually a professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, so the Tar Heels. He's also written The Watermelon King and The Kings and Queens of Rome. ROAM. Again, the novel itself is so interesting because it does blend these kind of magical kind of realism, and the way that this is written, the subheading of Big Fish is a novel of mythic proportions is pretty accurate, because again, the dad, Edward Bloom, and the son, William Bloom, the dad just can't help but tell these stories. And it's kind of like these big fish stories, right? These stories where people are going, you should have seen this fish we caught. It was the biggest thing you've ever seen, and it almost pulled us out of the boat, and all this, that, and the third, right? And when Daniel Wallace himself was actually writing this book, he was writing during his own father's illness, and he was kind of processing his grief through the fiction. And again, like I said, the structure of the novel, which is why you sometimes, I guess, you want to read the physical copy, even though I can't speak from experience. It's episodic, it's non-linear, and it's just these kind of stories that are all being kind of laid on us, but yet in this context of a son speaking with his dying father, right? And of course, the central conflict is truth versus storytelling. You know, it's, do you want to hear the truth, or do you want to hear what happened? And that's an interesting thing, right? It's, the truth is, you know, hopefully subjective, but it's hard when one person's telling the truth. Or you can tell a story, and the story tends to stick a little bit more. There's something more to it. That's why, I mean, there's something that still speaks to our it's not even an early primate brain. It's only been a few hundred years in human evolution, or maybe 1,000 or whatever, I guess, since we've gone away from the oral tradition. But it depends on the culture. Depends on the culture you're talking about. Like, since the written word, yeah, okay, maybe that's when the oral tradition died. But again, still, there's stories told, and there's things that are passed down through myth that aren't whole truths or half lies or whatever, but that's how that information gets passed and stored in our brain better, right? Because the human brain is good at keeping information, but it's fallible. It can change over time. And when you link some of these stories to myth and to anecdote and all these different other ways that we tell stories, allegory, I should say, not anecdote, to linking it to allegories of different things, that's how we remember them better. And it doesn't allow us to forget, because we can all hear that same story, and even if one of us starts telling it one way, someone might either correct it or not. And that's how stories get out of hand. You know, it's the old game of telephone. So again, this whole idea is stories as emotional truth rather than factual record, right? Like that you got to add some flair to it for it to make sense. And is that truth, right? Is that wrong? And again, you know, in the book itself, Edward Bloom is running into giants and witches and impossible adventures, and I think in a way, of course, this is Daniel Wallace or you know, the storyteller the royal storyteller, the cosmic storyteller, touching on the hero's journey, right? A hero leaving and coming back, and one of the quintessential hero's journeys is Oedipus, or sorry, not Oedipus, the Odyssey, Odysseus's journey, leaving Greece and coming back, and I guess it was anyway, wherever it was, but that is the quintessential example of the hero's journey, which, if you've never heard about the hero's journey, it is, I don't know if Joseph Campbell himself actually came up with this, but he speaks about, again, this universal archetype of the hero leaving, the hero having a call to adventure, usually having some type of supernatural aid. You leave the known into the unknown. There's some kind of threshold guardian there. Once you cross through that threshold, you're beginning the transformation. You usually run into a helper or mentor, go through a series of challenges and temptations. With another helper, enter the abyss, which is usually a death and a rebirth, which is some type of revelation. There's a transformation, there's an atonement, and then after that, you leave the unknown back to the known. You have the gift of the goddess is somewhere in the return there, and then you're back into the known, and then that either continues or whatever. And again, that's that story that exists forever. There's some call to action, The Hobbit, the fucking Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, all these fucking things where all of a sudden you're running in, you're leaving something known, you're leaving your home planet, you're leaving your home country, or you're leaving a state of mind, you're leaving a state of being, and you're entering this unknown, and you're usually guided by these different ideas and mentor. Again, stories, so many stories fit into this. Not every story, of course, but again, most stories, like, straight the fuck up. So, again, a lot of the stuff I saw as nods to the Odyssey specifically. Again, like I said, there's giants and witches, and there's a witch with one eye, and it's kind of like a little bit of a triple whammy, Greek myth kind of knock everyone, hit all the boxes at once with the Cyclops and the witches and the future, and it's all this fucking wild shit. So very, very cool. Kind of a la Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, the way they did that too, which I thought was really interesting. But again, are these in the story? Is Edward just using them as lies, metaphors, or something in between, right? And William's perspective is a frustration with a lack of this concrete truth, and he's sitting there kind of wrestling with these ideas of, what do we actually do here? What am I trying to gain? What am I ever going to figure this out? Am I just getting more and more upset, especially my father's last moments? Like, what the fuck? And again, there's something which, especially as a storyteller, sometimes those stories become part of your identity. The storytelling itself becomes part of your identity, and you kind of you rely on those stories in a way to shape your own reality. And that's how we've kind of always done things in human existence. Is myth is a way of shaping our reality. Storytelling is a way of shaping our own reality. I know as a kid, like, you watch movies and shit, you used to walk out of some of those action movies thinking you were 10 feet fucking tall. And, like, again, you hear the right story, someone's telling you the right story at the right time, it makes you feel certain ways, right? And if you can have some type of example, even if it exists in story, it gives you something to aim at least, instead of just kind of walking around aimlessly. Obviously, today's really interesting how people create their own narratives through social media and self-image. I think that's really interesting in the way that plays into the mythos and the zeitgeist, as it will. But again, I think facts explain events, but stories explain meaning. You can tell me the truth, or you can tell me what happened. You know what I mean? And again, in the book too, back to William and Edward's relationship, William and his father, the way it's portrayed is that this was something, the way his father talked about his life in these stories, it was fascinating to him as a kid. Almost like I said about the movies. It's fascinating to him as a kid. But then that admiration turned to confusion, and that confusion turned to resentment. And there's an emotional consequence in itself of myth making, is that it does create distance and misunderstanding, Freudian slip, misunderstanding, because again, what's the truth? I need to know, what are you leaving out? Why are you telling me the story this way? Why don't you just tell me the fucking truth? And eventually William, kind of goes from rejection to curiosity and back to acceptance. And, I think in a way he kind of realized, all these things, is that, do I really need to know what happened, or do I just need to know the man my father was? And, in masculinity, there's kind of there's that weird thing in a lot of male to male relationships, is that there's the emotional communication is it's mired in it's veiled, and it's rarely super out there and super clear, right? Like, just for whatever reason, and it's not just father and son relationships, it's other guy to guy relationships, it's weird. I don't know. Not every guy is super comfortable with doing that. It makes you feel less like a man. You're supposed to be whatever, right? Like, and it shouldn't be that way. I mean, that's kind of fucking, macho or stupid to think that way. But again, it's just, men do their best talking when they're both facing the same direction, not when they're both looking each other in the eye and having a heart to heart. That is not always the most comfortable position for all dudes. And it's just the way it is. And again, that's where stories in these hyperbolic situations can come through, because it gives you a cushion. It does create that distance, which is it makes you feel safer, right? And again, generational disconnect exists too, right? Like, more specifically, father and son, let alone son or grandson and grandfather, and then further. But generationally speaking, at least my parents' generation, it wasn't the most talkative generation. They went through wars and they went through crazy shit, and they were all traumatized, and they didn't, and drinking and doing all kinds of whatever, and not always talking about how they feel or what they went through in life. And then, all of a sudden it's too late. And then, my parents' generation have done a way better job of talking to their kids, which I know sounds like it shouldn't be much to ask, but again, it just seemed like it just wasn't done. It's a blanket statement. Obviously, there was different situations, and every household was completely different, of course. But on the whole, especially with specifically, I know from immigrant families, whatever, Italian, Polish, Lithuanian, Eastern European, of other types, Irish, all people who came over post-war, all this stuff, they were dealing with their own shit, and it wasn't a lot of talking. So anyway, the book kind of touches on that, right? Obviously. And again, it was, when, oh my gosh, when was it even? It was written in 1998. So again, he would have been from that generation where he's talking to his father, where there was more of that disconnect, in that generation. Right. So again, it's kind of one of these things where the whole kind of thought is, you don't always know what anyone's doing, but your relatives and your parents and your grandparents, you don't always know what they know. We don't really get the parents, we don't really get the story. We get the stories that they're capable of telling, kind of thing. And that's the thing, is that sometimes you can't even talk about, it's right. Like, I've always talked about this with anyone. It does not even have to be your parents. It's just like, it's really, really, really hard to ever actually get down to business when it comes to what I'm like when I'm talking to you. Are you hearing the words I'm saying the way I want you to hear them? Am I saying the words the way I'm thinking? Am I able to do that? How many filters are in the way? How many filters are my words passing through in your mind where, you know, again, it's just so hard to really tell people how you feel, and it's really hard to understand how they feel because there's so much other things in the way, your own ego, your own being, everything is it's so hard to take at complete face value too, right? Because there are weird hidden intents sometimes. There's subconscious things that are at play. There's so many different things that you can only understand someone the way you can understand them. And when they're talking to you in allegory, like in this story, in this novel, Big Fish, you're going to put all this different meaning on it because it has to pass through all these other filters of just understanding what the fucking what they're actually saying. So, you know, it's not always whether the story is true, but whether it brings you closer to the person telling it. It was really interesting, you know, the way in the book itself, you know, it ends, you know, spoiler alert, if you haven't read the book, obviously in Edward Bloom's final moments, it was kind of the ultimate story, you know, told by William himself. You know, and again, like I said, if you haven't read the novel or seen the movie, Edward himself slowly turns into this big giant fish. You know, and William tells the story of his father telling him to sneak him out of the hospital and bring him to his favorite part of the river, you know, in this creek where even in the story, William himself is like, I think this is the place that my dad used to tell me about, but I don't know. It looks like it, but who knows if that place even exists? But it does now. And, you know, it's kind of this thing where there's this role reversal. The son becomes the storyteller. It's this acceptance of myth as this love language because his father becomes this myth and he becomes the story. And people talk about this big fish that they saw that jumped out and kept stealing our lures or saved a kid or whatever. It's all kinds of craziness. But that's that story of the big fish. He's telling all these big fish stories and then he finally becomes one himself. And like it said, you know, it talks about legacy, right? We do become the stories that we tell about others. And in the end, we don't pass down facts. We pass down feeling. So again, is Edward Bloom a liar or an artist? Is William right to question, or is he wrong to resist? I don't know. You want to know the truth. I get it. You want to know, you want to see, but again, that's what the beauty of storytelling is. Edward is incapable of telling the truth the way William wants to hear it. So, you know, he does kind of adapt. And, you know, I think that's one of those things where, when we do talk about legacy again, you know, what are the stories that we want to pass on, right? And maybe we are all the big fish in our own story. So think about it. What are your own family stories? You know, what are things that you know are going to get passed down through legacies and live on forever, right? You know, as much as life can be short sometimes, it does live on in your stories, and it'll live on the stories that your family tells you. And then once they all forget, then it's really over. So come up with some stories. And again, you know, maybe that's the whole idea. Maybe truth isn't smaller than the story. Maybe it's just harder to see. Maybe I'll do an episode on the movie itself. It's a really good movie. I gotta go watch it again. So check it out, everyone. Really cool book. It's pretty short. And it's a good time. So again, get out there, make your own stories, be a real big fish. Love y'all. Talk to you next time. Peace.